Hello, my name is Sasha Struthers, and I'm going to do a video briefly on the difference between handymen and vendors and why it's very important that you use either or correctly. I bring this up mostly from a habitability standpoint. In Los Angeles, there's what's called the SCEP inspection, Systematic Code Enforcement Program, SCEP. And it's a program that tenants and landlords both pay into through what's called the SCEP fee. And the money is used to have these inspections. They're typically done every 2 to 3 years, and they'll batch them. So they'll do them by like areas of the city, that are rent controlled. But the SCEP inspection, what it produces is a report called the notice or order to comply. And it outlines, we inspected the property, here's the repairs that need to be done. And I go through this labor-intensive description of this for a very specific reason. A lot of times in rent-controlled areas that have these inspection programs, these reports come out and they're public record. So you can do a public records request and you can get copies of the inspection reports. And when habitability lawsuits come down, one of the number one things that's either pled into the lawsuit or is turned over in what's called discovery, when both parties ask each other questions and ask for documents, is usually the order to comply. And it's used against the landlord to say, hey, the city cited you and you had repairs you need to do. And then there's arguments that they weren't done timely or correctly, et cetera, et cetera. But within the order to comply, sometimes they'll have, line items of things that require permits. And as you go through the routine maintenance of a building, when you're a landlord, you tend to have usually a feeling or an understanding of what's going on with your building. And if not, that's a much broader topic, maybe for a different video I'll do. Probably pertaining to routine inspections of your buildings. But there's items that handymen are great at doing, and there's items that handymen are not great at doing. And I often see clients have handymen do them. And then they get busted because they go, whoa, this thing was not fixed correctly. And it's yeah, because you didn't delegate it to the right person. And I bring up again the SCEP inspection because it's usually the instance where things get revealed. Oh, there's this stuff that needs to be done. So handymen to me are, and how I use them and how I have things delegated to handymen, are for very routine, low skill, kind of simple repairs. Painting, patching drywall, fixing hardware, loose knobs, faucets, some light cleaning, leveling a shelf that's crooked or that's fallen, things like that. And depending on your handyman, they probably could do more. I don't think there's really less than that's kind of the threshold. That's the bare minimum of what handymen do. But some handymen can do a lot of things. Where I think the handyman should be limited and things should be delegated is for much larger repairs, like huge sewer backups, plumbing backups, which happen very common in apartment buildings because people don't understand you're not supposed to flush baby wipes, which is a pet peeve of mine. I'm now ranting and going on a tangent. But those sewer backups, plumber. In older buildings, the heaters are gas. There's wall heaters that are run by gas. So when gas leaks or those wall heaters don't work, you should have typically a plumber look at them because they're more experienced with that, as they can get complicated because you're dealing with gas. Electrical, anytime electrical's not working, if it's a simple breaker thing, usually the handyman can check the breaker. But if it's something larger, like a panel needs to be upgraded or you're trying to upgrade something, even maybe changing out light fixtures, you might want to have an electrician do that. Rain gutters, another one. You should have a rain gutter person do it. Pest control. I try to have, I once had a beehive, and I hired someone who like specialized in preserving the beehives and then like taking them, I guess, back into the wild, because bees are dying and we really need to take that seriously. But also the handyman was allergic to bees. But the handyman doesn't have the bee suit, like you should have a beekeeper. I think that's what they're called, as bee specialist. Come get that. And that's kind of like bathtub reglazing. Another thing, I just have a reglazer do it. Not necessarily is outsourcing stuff to someone who's licensed or certified, but definitely it also could be faster. Like a bathtub reglazer just does that for a living usually. They just reglaze bathtubs and sinks all the time. So they do it faster and cheaper than your handyman, because your handyman usually has to go get the stuff and it's kind of specialized. Another big one that I always caution people is mold. If there's mold in a unit or anywhere, you should have a mold remediation company come and address it, because they're usually certified and they'll usually give you a report of what they've done and they test, for the mold. But you also don't want a handyman messing with it, because you don't want them exposed to it. They don't have the protective gear and they'll tamper with it and could potentially spread the mold. So that's a big thing that I don't like handymen dealing with. And then of course, like big items like a roof, you obviously have a roofer do that. Or if you're going to be building walls or taking down walls, you want someone who is, more specialized or even licensed to do things like that. But I say that because sometimes, during the regular course of maintaining a building, repair requests come in, a landlord will get a request and they're like, oh, I'll have like the handyman go fix it. And it's usually something much bigger, but the handyman will probably say yes because they want the work, but it's outside of their scope and they might not necessarily be honest about that. So it ends up happening, and this is sometimes very common with plumbing. They'll try to go fix the plumbing problem and not admit or address that it's a much bigger problem than they can handle, that probably requires like an actual plumber, because sometimes it requires actually going into the line at the street. So you want to maybe have a plumber come in, and they usually have like a camera, like a snake, that can go in and see what's going on, and they have like the technology for that and the tools. But you'll want to outsource it, because then it may cost a few more bucks than your handyman, but it'll likely get repaired. And the handyman, won't keep coming back, and the plumber won't be coming back repeatedly to fix the same thing over and over again, which I've experienced in a building. The handyman said he could fix it. He told me the problem, then said he fixed the problem. And it would happen ongoing. And finally I sent a plumber, and the plumber goes, oh, this like whole thing needs to be replaced. Like the whole thing's rotted through and you need to replace it with this kind of pipe, and et cetera, et cetera. And it's also through the city, at the city line. So that has to be worked through. And, you spent a lot of money and time with the plumber, with the handyman doing the work, and he repeatedly had to go out. I had to repeatedly pay for him and repeatedly pay for supplies, and it didn't address the problem. But the plumber was able to address it one time. And in the long run, that was cheaper and would have fixed the thing earlier, and, I would have had less tenant complaints. So the handyman, I tried to keep to things that are routine and are within their kind of skill set and are very simple. But I don't like to delegate much bigger things to them, simply for the fact that it's outside of their skills, and it usually requires follow-up maintenance and never actually addresses the core problem. So, like going back to the beginning when I talked about the inspection, when you have the inspection and you get this notice of order to comply, sometimes it has on there, oh, you need to pull a permit to do this thing. Well, the permit takes time, as everybody knows, unless it's an express permit, which it could be. But a lot of times it always increases the time if you have to get a permit. And if this thing was addressed earlier on, and the required permits and documentation were put in place, then maybe this wouldn't be on the order to comply. But when you have anything that adds time and you can't comply with the order to comply on time, you risk getting in more trouble and facing, penalties, like city levied penalties, or potentially going to a hearing. And here in LA, they call it REAP, the rent escrow something program. REAP is simply I should know what REAP stands for, but like the name is so terrifying, I kind of don't. And I've gone to many REAP hearings too. But it's basically the city tells tenants you could pay us or you could pay your landlord, but pay us your rent money. Usually the tenants opt to pay the city, and the city holds your money until you fix the stuff you need to fix. And sometimes they add more stuff to the list. So the city's holding your rent money, but you're still expected to pay all of your bills and then do all of these repairs. So I really caution people on heavily relying on handyman, because down the line, your over-reliance on the handyman and you not paying attention to your repairs could end you in a hearing like that. And like that's what I consider like landlord jail, REAP, when your building enters REAP, and you like don't want that. So be mindful of what you're delegating, even though it seems like expensive to hire someone. And sometimes it's very hard because vendors, when they're good, they're busy. Sometimes it's very hard to find a good vendor. So I suggest people have a few, like have, 3 or 4 plumbers. And then maybe the plumbers are good for specific things. Have, 3 or 4 electricians. You probably kind of only need 1 roofer, but for, maybe bathtub reglazing, have 1 or 2 bathtub reglazers. You have to have like monthly pest control, so that's usually not an issue. And specialty stuff like bed bugs and bees and stuff come up once in a while, so you don't necessarily have to have someone. But if you know someone and they're good, don't lose their information. But try to have a roster of vendors. And if something comes to your attention, do your due diligence to see maybe if the thing is a much bigger issue. And the person who can help you with that would be an on-site resident manager, because they live in the building. And so they might tell you, hey, this is an ongoing problem. I suggest you send someone out, like a plumber or something. I always say plumbing because plumbing is like usually a big issue in multifamily, which is where this thing, where the vendor handyman most applies, is residential. But if your resident manager will typically know what's going on in the building because they also live in the building. So that is my 2 cents on the handyman versus the vendor. It is usually, a case-by-case scenario, unless it's very obvious that you need, a specialized person or a licensed individual to do the work. And that should help you not only maybe avoid getting written up for an inspection, but definitely if you get sued for habitability, having the records that you hired a professional and they did the work, and you have the records of it and the bids and the invoices and stuff like that. It'll definitely help you in a habitability lawsuit. If you have any questions or you're facing something, either a habitability lawsuit or potentially entering REAP, which before you get to REAP is a general manager's hearing, by all means you can reach out to me. Email is preferred because it's just much easier for me to get back to you. But if you have any questions, by all means reach out to me. Otherwise, thank you and good luck.